going to start to look at the point of view of Enlightenment thinkers and specifically what they thought about government. And I'm just going to foreshadow to the end of the pod that you're going to be completing, the last question, number 7. While you go through this lesson, think about how these ideas still exist in how we think about government and how our government is actually set up. Because many of the ideas that we're going to learn about today and tomorrow come from the Enlightenment time period, as I mentioned to you last week when we started learning about the Enlightenment. So the first guy that you're going to focus on for your pod today, specifically for questions 1 through 3, is John Locke. I've included this video, which is going to tell you a bit more about his life and his thinking. But what's really important for you to pay attention to is that his most well-known ideas is that people's natural rights should be protected by the government. However, the government should be based off of the consent of the governed, that people should be giving permission to their government. Now, I know we've been having some audio issues with our Padlet, so I took a screen recording of myself reading this. Just like I took a screen recording of reading this primary source, which I understand the language in this primary source is quite confusing, but what you really need to walk away from this is understanding that John Locke believes that everyone is born with natural rights, that each man and woman has the right to life, the right to property, the right to freedom or liberty. And that we, as a people, need to make sure that our government is going to protect those rights. So there has to be sort of this give or take between the people, the governed, and the actual government. And I just want to point out again that this right here, this screen recording, is me reading this. And then let's think about where in the present day do we see John Locke's ideas. So for instance, John Locke had a lot of influence on how the Declaration of Independence was written just, a few hundred years ago. But in the Declaration of Independence, it does say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I just want to note that what I'm talking about right now is going to help you with question 7. But we see some ideas come up. We see this idea of equality. We see this idea of the consent of government. And we see this idea of unalienable rights, rights that can't be taken away because this is what you're born with. So take a moment to look at this document as it will help you in question 7 if you so choose to talk about John Locke. I thought that this was a nice example of people giving consent. You have some sort of politician talking here. He's on kind of like a boardwalk, a plank, where if the people no longer agree with this person, if they walk off this, he's going to go into the gully, and if people aren't giving him consent, if people aren't giving her consent, then they're not going to follow him anymore, and hopefully people won't validate. And then also just this idea of voting, that we live in a democracy and we vote our officials in, and we're seeing more and more of a change of that, people holding officials more and more accountable. Then we move on to this guy, Baron de Montesquieu. He comes up with this idea that we use in our government today, the separation of powers, 3 branches of government. In our present day government, we have the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. They're supposed to hold each other accountable, and they're supposed to make sure that no one branch of government overpowers all the other branches and takes over. Okay? This video I thought did a nice job of explaining it, and it's made by students. They're high school students. And then we encounter, again, another primary source document. And really what I just mentioned above about balance of power through creating branches of government, that's the big takeaway for Montesquieu. He says in here, which I want to point out because you have to answer a question regarding this, but he says that every man invested with power is apt to abuse it and to carry his authority as far as it will go. To simply put it, people who have power abuse their power. Do we agree with him? Do we disagree with him? This is something that we've talked about a lot in global history. And again, I want to point out that at the end of this reading here is when he starts to talk about breaking the government up into several different branches of government. Watch this screen recording to have this reading above read to you, and I mentioned the branches of government there as well, just to really explicitly point out to you that the US Constitution, when it was written by the framers, again, just a few hundred years ago, they created the legislative branch, which is Congress, senators, and our House of Representatives, executive branch, the president, and the judicial. We have the Supreme Court. Supposedly, these three branches of government are supposed to hold each other accountable, and they're supposed to not let one branch have all of the power, you know, like maybe an absolute monarch, which we've been exploring. Absolute monarch has all the power. So Montesquieu is trying to advise us not to do that. I just thought that this was a great GIF expression. No government agency has jurisdiction over the truth. So I take that as no one of these government agencies can say, you know, this is it, because supposedly these other parts of the agency are going to hold them accountable. Okay? So take time, refer back to the mini lesson, take time watching this YouTube video, and remember, the audio recordings are now screen recordings. Follow along with those.